It was an unremarkable Tuesday morning when Lin Jun finally decided to make history. His lab was cluttered, as usual, with half-built machines, stacks of scientific journals, and coffee cups scattered across the surfaces like discarded thoughts. Lin didn't mind. The mess was a reflection of his mind, cluttered, constantly shifting, filled with fragments of ideas and theories yet to be realized. But today was different. Today, Lin was ready to cross a line. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the device before him, the sleek, glowing panel of buttons and wires that he had spent the last 3 years designing. It was the culmination of his work, a breakthrough that had been hailed by some of his colleagues as revolutionary and others as ethically questionable. It wasn't just a soul exchange, it was a new frontier. A chance to experiment, to explore, to leave the human body behind and experience the world through another set of eyes. Or pause. Or, fins, Lin, a voice crackled from the intercom on his desk. How's the test coming? It was Lu, his assistant, a bright young woman with more patience than Lin often had. She'd been with him since the beginning, but she didn't share his obsession with crossing boundaries. Lu was pragmatic. She followed the rules, like most people did. It's ready, Lin replied, his voice low with excitement. I'm going to test the exchange today. Human consciousness into an animal body. This is the next step. Lu didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was laced with concern. Lin, we've talked about this. The ethics board won't approve. You're talking about breaking the rules. No one's ever attempted an animal exchange. What if something goes wrong? Lin rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a twinge of doubt. But only for a second. His research was too important. I've double-checked the system. It's foolproof. We're not talking about just switching a body, Lu. We're talking about understanding a different consciousness. Think about it. The implications for neuroscience, for empathy, for everything. Just remember, if it goes wrong, it's on you, Lu warned, her tone turning stern. Lin smirked and disconnected the intercom, pushing her concerns aside. She'd always been too cautious. But Lin? He was ready to take risks. He'd been waiting for this moment for years, and today, he was going to make history. With a deep breath, he activated the machine. A series of hums and whirs filled the room as the interface powered up. Lin's body hummed with anticipation as he prepared to swap consciousness with the animal, his target, a dog. Not just any dog, but the golden retriever named Biscuit, the pet of the CEO, Mr. Kong. Lin had arranged everything, from the logistics to the careful timing of the exchange. Biscuit's body was as healthy as could be, and his nervous system would be the perfect vessel for Lin's human mind to enter. Let's do this, Lin muttered to himself, pressing the final button on the control panel. A brilliant flash of light enveloped him, and in the blink of an eye, his world went black. When Lin's eyes fluttered open again, he was met with an overwhelming sense of disorientation. His body felt wrong. He tried to move his hands, but instead of fingers, he felt paws, large, furry, and utterly foreign. A burst of confusion struck him like a lightning bolt. His first instinct was to scream, but all that came out was a high-pitched bark. It was a ridiculous, squeaky sound, embarrassing even, as though the universe was mocking him. He jumped to his feet, or at least, tried to. His body didn't quite respond as he expected. There was a strange disconnect, as if his mind had been shoved into a body that was trying to escape its own limits. His vision was blurry, but he could make out the shape of the lab, now towering over him like an alien landscape. The walls seemed so much farther away. The desk, the chairs, the equipment, all looked immense. His heart raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. Lin tried to stand, his legs wobbling beneath him as he fought to balance. He stumbled over his own paws, the ground beneath him too soft, too giving, as though he was walking on a cushion of air. What happened? The panic surged again, but instead of a human voice, a series of frustrated barks filled the air. He could feel the sharp pull of anxiety, but it was mixed with something else, something instinctual. The urge to move, to chase, to fetch, no. No, 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 Lin muttered to himself, though it came out as a series of confused growls and whimpers. He turned in circles, trying to make sense of the new body. His vision was sharper, yet not quite right. His sense of smell overwhelmed him. He could detect every scent in the room. The sterile smell of the lab, the faint trace of coffee, and biscuit scent. It was everywhere. It was him. This was Biscuit's body. A dog? Lin Zhen, a scientist, was in the body of a dog? The absurdity of it hit him with the force of a freight train, but before he could spiral into a panic attack, the door to the lab creaked open. "All right, Biscuit, let's get you to your..." The voice belonged to Mr. Kang's assistant, a middle-aged woman named Yumi, who was clearly startled when she saw Biscuit in the lab. "What on earth are you doing here?" she muttered, shaking her head as she walked over to pet him. Lin's new instincts kicked in. "Pet me. Pet me." He couldn't help it. He sat down and raised a paw, nudging at her leg as if on autopilot. Yumi looked down, her confusion quickly morphing into a small smile. "Ah, Biscuit, you're such a needy thing," she chuckled, reaching down to scratch his ears. Lin's mind was on fire, screaming in frustration, but his body responded to the affection, leaning into the touch with a kind of involuntary pleasure that he could feel it now, the emotional pull of being Biscuit. The simple joy of the touch, the warmth of human affection. It was intoxicating in its simplicity. "Focus. Focus, Lin." But as Yumi cooed at him and rubbed his belly, Lin's sense of horror deepened. He was Biscuit. In every way, his consciousness had been swallowed by this animal's instincts. And worse, he couldn't talk. He couldn't explain what had happened. He couldn't make them understand. Yumi clicked her tongue. "You're getting into everything today, aren't you?" she said, laughing. "Come on, let's get you back to Mr. Kong." But as she reached for his collar, Lin snapped into a new kind of panic. "No. I can't stay here. I have to get back to my body. I have to reverse this." He darted past her, his new body reacting with a speed that took him by surprise. He ran headlong into the hallway, his paws skittering across the polished floor. He tried to bark, to call out for help, but instead of words, all that came out was a frantic, desperate bark. "Biscuit, what are you?" Yumi began, but she was quickly left behind as Lin scrambled down the corridor, the sound of his paws echoing through the halls. The absurdity of it all hit him again. Lin Zhen, top scientist at one of the world's most advanced companies, was now running around as a dog. He could hear the whispers in his head, "What had I done?" But they didn't sound like his thoughts anymore. They were Biscuit's. The instinct to run, to hide, to chase. It wasn't Lin. It was Biscuit. And Lin had no control. This wasn't a simple experiment gone wrong. This was a disaster. But in the middle of the chaos, something unexpected happened. For a fleeting moment, he forgot about his human self. He forgot about his research. He forgot about everything except for the wind in his fur, the freedom of movement, the joy of chasing something with no real purpose. And then, in that split second, Lin Zhen realized something else. He wasn't just in a dog's body. He was living a dog's life. Lin barely noticed how quickly the hallways passed under his paws, his mind too consumed with the strange, surreal sensation of being inside Biscuit's body. His instincts had taken over, his feet pounding against the polished floors, his heart hammering in his chest. The sharp scent of the office, a mix of coffee and fresh paper, overwhelmed his senses. For a moment, he just ran. It wasn't until he rounded a corner and came face to face with a glass window that reality crashed back in. His reflection caught him off guard, Biscuit, the golden retriever, staring back at him with wide, confused eyes. He could see the animal's fur glistening in the fluorescent light, the wagging tail twitching nervously, as if it too wasn't sure whether it wanted to run or stay. Lin stopped dead in his tracks. That he let out a sharp bark, demanding, confused, and loud, but no one answered. Panic surged again. What am I doing? He could feel his breath, quick and shallow, the air moving in and out of a body that wasn't his own. His tail wagged involuntarily, and the warmth of the glass against his nose made him feel something strange, a dull ache, like homesickness. But he wasn't at home. He was trapped inside Biscuit's body. And somehow, something had gone terribly wrong that he had no idea how to fix it. Without warning, he darted forward again, but this time his mind was working, scrambling for a solution. He had to find a way back. He had to reverse the experiment, undo whatever had gone wrong. But how? He couldn't remember the sequence of the machine, couldn't recall the specifics of the code he'd written. It was all a blur now, like trying to piece together fragments of a dream that dissolved the moment he woke, and then, as though by fate, the door at the end of the hall opened. Mr. Kong stepped through, tall and impeccably dressed, a coffee cup in one hand, his phone in the other. He glanced down at Biscuit without a second thought, an amused smile crossing his face. Well, look who decided to go on an adventure this morning, he said, his voice light and unconcerned. He didn't notice the panic in Biscuit's eyes, or rather, in Lin's eyes. Mr. Kang's attention was already elsewhere, focused on something important that only he could see. Let's get you back to the office, you little troublemaker. Biscuit, Lin, froze. The urge to follow was so strong that it nearly paralyzed him. He wanted to obey, to fall back into the familiar routine, the routine that Biscuit's body was so well accustomed to. But that wasn't his routine. Lin didn't belong here, in this body, in this life. Yet it felt like the more he resisted, the harder it became to shake off Biscuit's instincts. With a jerk of his head, Lin pulled himself free from his trance-like state, focusing instead on his surroundings. Mr. Kong was walking away, expecting the dog to follow. Lin had no choice but to obey. He had to play along, for now. For his own sanity. He trotted after Kong, his movements awkward and disjointed at first, but gradually more fluid. He tried not to think about the impossibility of the situation, tried not to dwell on how surreal it was to have 4 paws instead of 2, a tail instead of legs, a snout instead of a mouth. As they walked, Lin noticed the subtle shifts in the way people treated him. The assistants who passed by smiled down at Biscuit, petting him absent-mindedly, calling him by his name as if he were nothing more than an ornament in the office. The casual affection, the way they scratched behind his ears as if they were doing him a favor, it made Lin's stomach churn. He could feel the shift in his own thoughts, how easy it was to give into the simplicity of it all. But this wasn't him. This wasn't his life. All right, Biscuit, stay close now, Mr. Kong muttered absently as he opened the door to his office. He didn't even look down when Lin followed him inside. Just keep an eye on me, all right? You're my lucky charm. Lucky charm. Lin almost scoffed at the irony. Biscuit's body was lucky, sure, but not in the way Kong thought. It wasn't because the dog was some source of inspiration. It was because Kang's company had been using Biscuit as a tool, as a means to look more human, more relatable. The irony of it all made Lin sick. This was a company that prided itself on its technological advancements, yet it couldn't see the dangers of its own inventions, its own experiments. He glanced around the office. It was immaculate, pristine, designed with the kind of care that only the ultra-rich could afford. The gleaming glass windows, the expansive desk, the sleek furniture, it all felt so alien to Lin now. He'd been here 100 times before, but it wasn't his world anymore. Not when he was living inside Biscuit, trapped in an animal's life. Kong settled into his chair, his phone in hand. He didn't seem to notice that his dog had been acting strangely, that Biscuit wasn't behaving like he usually did. Lin could feel his frustration mounting. He wanted to shout, wanted to rip the illusion apart and make Mr. Kong understand what had happened. But instead, all he could do was sit, and wait, and watch. Watch as the man continued his day with the same casual indifference, as if nothing had changed. It was like watching someone live in the same house, day after day, knowing all the while that they were completely oblivious to the fact that the walls were slowly caving in around them. "Stay there," Kong muttered again, and with a casual flick of his wrist, he dismissed Biscuit, Lin, from the office, as if the dog were nothing more than a decorative piece, a token of comfort. Lin's heart sank that he tried to protest, tried to make sense of it all. He wanted to stand up and yell, "This is wrong. I'm not a dog. I'm a scientist. I was part of the team that designed your company's most advanced technology. I'm Lin Jun, not Biscuit. Get me out of here." But no words came. Only a soft whine, a frustrated whimper. It was as though Biscuit's body had stolen his voice, taken his agency, and wrapped it all up in an animal's helplessness. With a final glance at Mr. Kong, Lin wandered out of the office, barely able to control his movements. The world felt so distant now. He was walking through it, but he was no longer part of it. Everything was too loud. The voices in the hallway, the phones ringing, the quiet hum of machines in the background, they all grated on his senses, making him dizzy. He needed to escape. He needed to find a way back. In a daze, Lin made his way to the back stairwell, the same stairwell he used to take when he was in the lab, before this all went wrong. The stairwell was empty, the faint scent of cleaning supplies lingering in the air, and the walls stretched upward, almost mocking him with their size. "Focus," he told himself. "Focus." But something had changed. He could feel the shift in his mind, a dull but persistent pull to the simpler life of the dog. The urge to forget. The urge to just be. It wasn't human. It wasn't rational. But it was there, gnawing at him, pulling him deeper into Biscuit's instincts. He shook his head, trying to fight it off. He couldn't lose himself like this. Not now. Not when he was so close to figuring out how to fix this. The door to the stairwell opened behind him. Lin froze, his body going rigid. He turned, his heart in his throat. There stood Mr. Kong, his expression one of mild confusion. "What are you doing here, Biscuit?" he asked, bending down as though talking to a child. "Come on, get back to your spot. I need you here." Lin growled, the sound strange in his throat, but he refused to follow. Not anymore. But Kong didn't seem to mind. With an almost dismissive gesture, he snapped his fingers and walked away. "All right, fine. Stay out of trouble," he said, his voice fading as he walked down the hall. For the first time, Lin realized the truth. Mr. Kong didn't care. He didn't even see him anymore. He was just a dog, a pet, a toy that could be forgotten as easily as it was remembered. Lin stood alone in the stairwell, shaking. The worst part? He wasn't sure if he was more terrified of never returning to his own body, or of losing himself completely in Biscuit's world. Lin's paws felt heavier than they ever had before, as though the weight of Biscuit's body was pressing him further into the earth. His instincts were fighting with his reason, and it felt like the longer he stayed in this dog's body, the harder it became to hold on to the fragments of himself that were slipping away. Mr. Kang's footsteps faded into the distance, and for the first time since the exchange, Lin stood still, unsure of what to do next. He had been in labs, offices, and experimental chambers, but none of them had ever felt as confining as this sterile stairwell. There were no walls to climb, no breakthroughs to chase. Just emptiness and the crushing realization that he was now an animal, trapped in a body that was never meant for him. A deep, guttural bark escaped him, but it wasn't the sound of frustration he had hoped for. It was a bark of submission. Biscuit's body seemed to have taken control again, and for a moment, Lin wondered if he was even capable of fighting it off. Then, just as quickly, something snapped inside him. This was his life. His. He couldn't let it go like this. He had come too far. This wasn't some science experiment where he could casually quit. If he didn't fix it soon, he would become nothing more than a forgotten, nameless dog in some high-powered CEO's office. He needed to return to the lab. He needed the machine. The only problem was, the lab was on the other side of the building, through floors and hallways that he had no business walking down as a dog. But even as he thought it, the strange compulsion to stay behind, to follow Kang's orders, to just curl up in the corner and let everything go, pulled at him again. It felt like a weight on his chest, suffocating. He growled, fighting the urge to lie down. Not today. Lin bounded toward the door, managing to open it with a delicate nudge of his nose, before pushing his way into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered above, and the soft hum of distant voices echoed through the narrow space. The scent of coffee and fresh paper was replaced by something more pungent, the sharp tang of antiseptic from a nearby bathroom. He could hear a few murmurs of conversation from inside the adjacent rooms, the low murmur of office workers talking about deadlines and reports. He wanted to scream, to break free of this mindless routine, but all that escaped him was a low, sharp whine. Lin pressed forward, his pace quickening. He had to reach the lab. He had to reverse the exchange. But the further he went, the more he felt like he was moving in circles, running through the motions of Biscuit's life. The hallway, once an environment that felt sterile and clinical, had now transformed into a maze, a series of tunnels leading nowhere. His body was moving on autopilot, instinct pulling him through a familiar routine that wasn't his. He could smell the floors and the people ahead. He knew where to go. He stopped. Ahead of him was the open door to the cafeteria, and Lin could feel his heart race at the sudden pull toward the food. Biscuit's mind, he realized, was completely taken over by simple, animal instincts. The same instinct that made him wag his tail when someone petted him, the same instinct that made him stop and sniff the ground whenever he caught a whiff of something interesting. Lin let out a frustrated huff, trying to push back against the urge to wander in and find the nearest scraps of food. He had to stay focused. The lab. The machine. But when he turned to move, there was a voice behind him. Biscuit? It was Yumi. What are you doing in here? You're supposed to be with Mr. Kong. Lin froze, his hackles rising instinctively. It was almost as if Biscuit's body wanted to react to the sound of his name. His mind felt stretched between two worlds, his human world and this new, simpler one. He stood there, motionless, staring at her. Hey there, boy, she said softly, walking toward him with a smile. Come on, let's get you back where you belong. Yumi's voice was soothing, her tone familiar, and Lin felt his legs betray him. His tail wagged uncontrollably as she approached, and the instinct to obey, to fall back into the comfortable pattern of being Biscuit, the pet, nearly overwhelmed him. No. I can't. Not now, Lin grunted, but it came out as another dog-like whine. He felt his body shift again, his attention diverted, but this time, he fought it. He needed to stay focused. Don't worry, Yumi cooed. Mr. Kong won't be mad. He just likes to have you around. She reached out, her hand coming toward his head, the familiar touch of affection that Biscuit must have adored. It was so easy to fall into the comfort of it, so easy to close his eyes and give in. But Lin resisted, snapping his mouth shut just as her fingers grazed his fur. Not today, he growled softly under his breath. Yumi froze, taken aback by the sound, her hand halting in midair. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked down at Biscuit. Something in her expression shifted. For a moment, she looked puzzled, almost as if something was off. Biscuit? She asked, her voice uncertain. What's wrong with you today? Lin could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air, and it made him uneasy. He was trapped in a body that wasn't his, trying to hold on to his humanity, but to everyone else, he was just another dog. To them, he was Biscuit, and that was the only version of himself they would ever see. The longer he stood there, the more he could feel the connection between his human mind and the dog's instincts slipping away. The more time he spent as Biscuit, the harder it became to think clearly. He turned away from Yumi, his body moving almost of its own accord, his legs carrying him down the hall without his full consent. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. But where could he go? What was left to do but run? Lin's mind raced. There had to be a way to reverse the process. He had to get back to the lab. But how? The corridors all looked the same, and there was no sign of any lab workers in sight. Everything felt like it was fading, slipping out of his grasp. He turned a corner and froze. Ahead of him was the lab, its door slightly ajar, the familiar hum of machinery filling the air. This was it. Lin walked forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he pushed open the door. The lights inside flickered on, and the sterile, clinical air of the lab rushed to meet him. His eyes locked on the machine, the device that had caused all of this. His lifeline. His only hope. His tail flicked with agitation as he took a step closer. It was there. It was so close. But as Lin approached, something strange happened. The machine powered down, the light dimming, the hum fading away. His heart skipped a beat. No, no, no. He had to make it work. He couldn't stay here. Not as Biscuit. Not forever. With a surge of desperation, Lin ran to the console. His paws, large and awkward, fumbled over the controls, and he let out a frustrated bark when nothing happened. Focus. Focus. He pushed harder, pawing at the screen, trying to remember the sequence, the exact sequence that would bring him back. But then, it happened. The lights above flickered once more. The machine hummed back to life. Lin felt it, a rush of energy surging through the air, like electricity vibrating in his bones. The machine, the device, was coming back online. Lin hesitated. Could he fix it? Was it too late? And then, just as quickly, he realized what he had to do. His body quivered, his mind racing as the machine powered on, pulling him into its web once more. He wasn't just trying to fix an experiment anymore. He was fighting to save himself. He braced for what was to come.